today I'm going to tell you all about die cutting. I'm starting all the way back to being a beginner. We're going to cover everything from what the die cut machine does to what else are we going to go over? To the tools that we use, the difference between a wafer thin and a steel ruled die, what dies are versus die cuts, and then I'll show you a little bit of die cutting. Okay, this is my Spellbinders Platinum 6. This is my favorite die cutting machine, with an exception of my mini sidekick that I have here. This is a mini die cutting machine that I'm absolutely in love with, but it doesn't do everything that I need it to do. That's why I want to tell you about the Spellbinder 6. Spellbinder 6 has a new platform that they improved on their original design because of the 3D embossing folders that came on the market. There are instructions on how to do, it's called a sandwich. When you put together the plates on the platform with your dies and your paper, it's referred to a sandwich that you use to put through your die cutting machine. On the platform, it tells you there's several layers. There's plate A, or the platform base, plate B, which is the platform top, plate C, which are the cutting plates, plate D is for embossing folders, and plate E is to emboss with a die. We'll go over more about the plates in just a second. What I next want to tell you about is what the die cutting machine does. When you put your sandwich with your die and your plates and your paper through the machine, you crank it, and what it's doing is putting pressure, and that's why the sharp edges of a die will cut the paper from the pressure that is put down on it when you crank it through. There are wheels inside that are long, I guess, I don't know, tubes, for lack of a better term, that the plates go through as you're cranking it, and that pressure is what cuts the paper. So let's set this aside, and I will show you the difference between a steel ruled die and a wafer thin die. A wafer thin die is called a wafer thin die based on the fact that it is very thin piece of metal, sharp edges in the shape, or in this case, in the with the letters that spell a word, that allows you to cut your image. A steel ruled die is this here, and what it does, fumbling, is it's the same premise. This is a foam pad with plastic on the opposite side, but there is steel in the shape of the image that you cut, and that's pointing up. The difference between, first you'll need a different sandwich. This wafer thin die, you will need the platform and the plate B and 2 plate C's. With the steel ruled die, it's as if it has its own platform, and all you need are 2 C plates when you're putting your sandwich through. You put the material on top, you put one of the cutting plates on top and one on the bottom. That's how you put the sandwich through. The difference is the steel ruled die is much deeper, the metal is much deeper, so that, or the cutting edge is much deeper. So you're able to put, I think I read, up to 6 or 8 pieces of paper or cardstock on top of it as you push it through. Where did I read that? I thought I read, I'm not sure where I read that. I think it's either 6 or 8 pieces of cardstock when you put it through, and it will cut that thick material. It will also cut leather. Here it says cotton, balsa wood, burlap, grunge board, thin acrylic or plastic, wool, cork, denim, magnetic sheets, foil, screen, aluminum, tin, craft metal, cardstock, newspaper, chipboard, wallpaper, and vellum. So cuts most crafty materials. A wafer thin die is only going to be able to cut through lighter materials. It will cut through your cardstock. It may cut through thin chipboard, and it will cut through vellum, foil. I've never tried cutting through a magnetic sheet before, but it will cut through most thin materials. So that's the difference between a steel ruled die and a wafer thin die. Most often in the paper craft industry, we use the wafer thin dies, and I think that's all there is to tell about that. The next thing I want to tell you is the difference between a die and a die cut. A die cut is what results after putting the material through the die cutting machine. The die is the actual metal piece that cuts the image. I hear often, very, very often in the industry, people mixing up those terms, so I wanted to just put that out there for everybody. Here, I'm going to bring this in a little bit tighter. Die cuts are the paper, dies are the metal. Set those aside, and let's go over the tools. So besides the die cutting machine and the paper or cardstock that you'll use, there are a couple of tools that I would recommend you have. The one that you, or actually there's 2 that you actually need in order to get started. Most dies, when you purchase them new, are tabbed. That means they have the tabs in there that are connecting it to another metal piece. If it's more than one, let me bring this tighter and we can show you. The tabs are what is connecting this inner die to this outer die. And what we need to do is use our first tool, which is a wire snips or a wire cutter. And let me grab a towel. How I would recommend that you cut the the tab is place your wire cutters. Actually, the first cut we make is not going to be a problem. Put your wire cutters as close to the image as you can and just make a snip. Now the next cut that we make is going to cut that tab completely off. What I recommend you do is get your wire cutters in position to cut that tab. Oh, this tab is so small. And then you can wrap a towel or a cloth around it and give it a squeeze, and that will help you catch the wire piece, which I don't know where it is now. It must have gone flying. It'll help you, most times that will help you catch the wire piece or the metal piece that you clip. So again, you just, and here is a flush side here is an open side. So what you want to do is put the flush side next to the image and clip. Then the next one, you're going to turn it around, put your wire cutters in position, holding it, and give it a clip in that towel. Where do they go? I don't know where they're going. Are they in the towel? I don't feel them in the towel. Oh, that's strange. So I'll do that one more, or it looks like we'll have to do it 2 more times. I'm going to cut that away from the shadow, and then put this in position, cover it with a towel, and give it a squeeze. Looks like, oh, there it was, but I don't know where it went this time. I'm going to try to do it one more time a little bit closer. Okay, that time I see the little metal piece. Okay, we have one more. Put it in position, cover it with my towel to catch that metal piece, and give it a squeeze. So you have to be careful. Sometimes I'll even take a metal file and file these edges because they are very sharp. You have to be careful. Most paper crafters, I believe, at one time or another, have probably cut themselves on a die. So there's that, and then here we have the tabs are still on 2 different positions in here. I'm going to put that in, give it a squeeze. Get that over there. I think I'm going to have to give this one 2 squeezes. Oh, no, it came off. And then there's one more in there. I hope I'm still on screen. Oopsie. Have that. And there's my little metal piece. So that is cutting apart the dies. One thing that is very awesome is that Spellbinders actually pre-tabs all of their dies. In fact, I don't think I've ever got a die from Spellbinders that I've had to cut apart. So all of this is brand new. I've never used these dies, and notice that there are no connections to each other. These are all separate dies that can come apart. No cutting necessary. That is why one of the reasons why Spellbinders is one of my favorite companies for dies. Okay, what's on our list next? Okay, our next tool is the pokey tool. And that is just any kind of piercing tool that you can use. And the reason for that is, a good example would be here. Once you run this through, it's very often your paper will be stuck in the grooves of the die. In order to release the paper, you will need that pokey tool to push it out from these little circles from the backside of the die. Pokey tool is necessary if you're going to be doing die cutting with the die cutting machine. Besides those 2 tools, everything else is extra. What I use to manage the die cut paper, especially small pieces, I will use what is this called? A jewel picker. And what it has is this wax tip, and it helps, let me give you an example, handle small die cuts. So the wax tip will temporarily adhere to the die cut, and you're able to pick them up and put them on your project very easily. Otherwise, you're having to slide them off the edge, and it's also your fingers get in the way, so you can't manage exactly where you want to put it. Jewel picker, one of my favorite tools, but it is not necessary to do die cutting or to manage the die cutting. It just makes life much easier. Another tool are reverse tweezers, and when you squeeze them, they open, and when you release, it's going to grab onto your paper. Let me show you. So I'm not squeezing now, and it's holding my paper. Very awesome tool. Works in the same way that the jewel picker works, where when you're putting it on your project, it gives you lots of control, keeps your hands out of the glue when you're gluing your die cut, and allows you to, with precision, place your die cut on your project. Next tool that I rarely use, the only time I use this is if I have a very intricate die that I have to pop out lots of tiny pieces from my die. It's more to clean the die from all of the debris than it is to actually manage the die cut. And what it is a stiff bristle on a spinning wheel, I guess you could call it. And what you would do is, this is a bad example of the word die, but you would basically run it on the back side of the die, and these bristles are going to poke through those tiny holes and push the paper out. It also has a magnetic end, and I notice it has several of the little pieces of the tabs from the die cuts on the bottom. Anyways, a magnetic piece. Hold onto your dies, so it helps when you have tiny dies to have any kind of a magnetic tool nearby so that you don't lose them. Because tiny dies, I actually have another example of what to do with your tiny dies as opposed to cutting them apart. What I like to do is I will leave them together. Instead of tabbing the die when I purchase it, I will leave the small dies connected to another die. This, the only kind of problem that you have when you leave them together is that your paper might cut out the second image and you may only want one image cut. I hope I'm making sense. In this instance, in order to use the shadow die, you have to cut the word die out because if you were to leave it in place, it would cut the word, and it would only cut an outline of the word and the outline of the shadow, making it defeat the point, I guess, of having a shadow die. Okay, let's see. Next, let me clean this up, and I'll be right back. Next, we're going to talk about actually doing the die cutting. When you're I'm going to show on my mini die cutter since it's easier to get it in the camera view. But basically, the steps are the same that I'm going to explain to you. You will normally get 2 of the acrylic die cutting plates. What my best practice is that I will cut into one. That means the sharp edge of the die is always going to be pointed towards the cutting plate that I cut into. And what I do, a problem that can happen when you are cutting into only one plate and not cutting into the other, is that you'll get warping of your dies. I'm not sure if you can see that there's a space in between. There's a little bit of a bend in the cutting die, or the cutting plate that I've been cutting into. It needs to be flipped over often. So I'll cut into one side and then flip it over, cut into the other side. That will prevent most of the warping of the plates. The reason that you only want to cut into one plate and not cut into the other is all of these cut lines on the plate will show up on your paper. If you're cutting into the top plate, it's going to show on your paper all of these cut lines. Once you do run some paper through the die cutting machine, you'll notice on the side, if you're using a used plate like this, on the underside, you will have they almost look like scratch marks on your paper. So if you leave one plate uncut and always put that on top, you should prevent your die cuts from getting those scratch marks on there. The next thing I'm going to recommend is that when you are using let me get this into frame. I'm using several different dies here. There's 2 tips that I want to give you. First of all, if you're going to use one piece of paper, I'm going to give this one a cut. Just cut it through the center. If you're using one piece of paper, it's instinctual for us to want to put these dies as close as we possibly can to save the paper, to try to put them together. This may be a problem because when your dies are super close together, they may not cut all the way through. So if you're having a problem with your dies not cutting all the way through the paper, you might want to make sure, and you're cutting more than one die at a time, you might want to make sure that you spread them out, give them lots of room to go through the die cutting machine and have that equal pressure from the machine. The next thing I would suggest is put your smallest die closest to one end of the cardstock and one end of the plate. Put your larger dies behind it. That means that when it goes through the plate, only this die will get the pressure, and then this die will get its own pressure as it goes through. This also will prevent warping of your plates. If you always use the small end going through, in fact, we should turn these around. Have the smaller end go through first, and then open up to the larger end. If you have a die like this, where one side is wide and one side is narrow, you want to turn it so that it's going through in the narrow direction, but you still would want to put that die, actually it's upside down, let me flip that over, have it in line with the next die. And same here. Let's see. When you're putting your dies on your plate, you want to watch out for the ends. If you have tapered ends at the end of your cutting plate, you don't want your die to be above those tapered lines because it will not cut. Or if it does, it will be a partial cut. The next thing I would recommend, if I were to pick this up and put the top plate on, there's a really good chance that the dies are going to move around. What I recommend is using some low-tack tape. Now, there are craft tapes on the market that are low-tack tape, and to me, they're expensive. What I will use is, this is paper tape, and before I use it, I put it on my skin and pull it off, get some of that tack off. And then I will tape down my dies. Another tape that is relatively inexpensive that is low-tack is highlighter tape. The highlighter tape, the only thing that I've really found to be a problem with a highlighter tape is that it leaves quite a bit of residue. Now, all of these dies are all enclosed. There's no open spots that the tape is going to touch the paper die cut once it's cut. So I don't have to worry about residue from this tape. But I will show you an example in just a second after I send this. Come on now. Oh, wrong way. After I send this through my machine. And I had suggested that, or I had indicated that the Platinum 6 is my favorite die cutting machine, and that is a true statement. But I recommend, if my second favorite is this miniature sidekick by Sizzix and Tim Holtz. The sidekick is tiny, the plates are very small, and it doesn't take as much cranking to get the plate to go through. Now with the Platinum 6, the plates are longer, so it takes quite a bit more cranking to get that entire plate through the die cutting machine. We'll just poke these out. Come on now, there you go. And there are our die cuts. These are layers for the mushrooms. Okay. Another recommendation is to get yourself a sorting tray, especially if you're cutting multiple colors of cardstock or multiple images and more than one of the same image. I would recommend a sorting tray of some kind. A couple examples are this palette that I'm using here. I think I got this like 6 for $1 on Amazon or something. If I can find it, I will put it in the comments section. Another example is this larger ceramic palette. Actually, just puppy hairs. And here it gives me lots of different slots to put different colors, and these are most of them are layered die cuts. It gives me lots of area to separate my different die cuts. So I would recommend some kind of a sorter. Now, if you're only, like I just did, cutting one color of paper, getting something like a little dish. These are, what are they, like dipped dishes for little, are they called ramekins? Something like that. Little dishes that you put sauce in or something to that effect, dressing. Those are nice too. You can just put, as you're cutting, just put them all in there and then go through them when you're all finished. That's another suggestion that I would recommend, is when you're doing a project, decide what you would like, what die cuts you would like to use. Do all of your die cutting in one session in the beginning. I also recommend that you die cut more than you need. Then you don't have to pull the die cutting machine out again and go through all of that process again. If you have leftover die cuts, the way that I organize my dies is I keep them in a plastic sleeve. Just when you're putting away your dies, put your extra die cuts that you're not going to use for this project in the back of the pocket behind the dies. Okay, let's see. Can we get this one through here? Yes, we can. Okay, we're going to take this other piece, see if it's large enough. We're going to pretend like this piece is large enough. Let's see, maybe it's larger at the other end. And what I was talking about before about the residue on tape, what I do to prevent the residue from getting on my die cut is, when I'm taping down my die, I tape it down so that it goes on the outside edge of the die, so that it's not on the inside, on where my die cut will be. So we will, oops, tape to my plate, and this is face down so that it's cutting into that plate down there, and this is my top plate. Because this is such a small plate system, I can't tilt my die, which is another recommendation, so that the smallest area goes through at one time. That prevents plates from warping. Another thing that you'll notice is that when you're going, sometimes you hear that cracking. Sometimes when you're die cutting, that cracking is normal, and it doesn't mean that anything's wrong. It's just one of the noises that the die cutting machine will make, or it's actually the plates with the pressure that is making that noise. So another tip is this low tack tape can be used multiple times. Just stick it on your die cut machine and use it the next time you run it through. Oh, you can't really see that on the on the video. I think that's all I have to show you right now. I will be doing another video, a die cutting for beginners part 2. Come back and I will have more tips for you to learn how to die cut like a pro. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.